Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Friedrich Nietzsche. What if everything you know, every belief you cherish isn't knowledge but carefully curated ignorance? What if your comfort is the real prison? You've lived your whole life inside a room. It has no windows, no clocks, no mirrors, just soft lighting, comfort, and familiar walls painted with ideas handed down to you since birth. They told you everything you needed was in that room: truth, love, purpose, even yourself. So you stayed. You learned the rules. You obeyed the voices in the room that called themselves wisdom. But one day, the light flickers. For a moment, you see a crack in the wall, thin, barely noticeable, yet real. Something moves behind it. You're not supposed to look. You feel it in your bones. Don't look. But you do. And in that moment, everything begins to shake. Now ask yourself, what if ignorance isn't the absence of knowledge, but a force, a choice, a cage we guard from the inside? You've been told that ignorance is just not knowing, an unfortunate flaw of incomplete education. But what if that's a lie? What if ignorance is something deeper or darker and deliberate? Nietzsche didn't see ignorance as mere lack of information. No, he saw it as a stubborn, often unconscious commitment to not see. A refusal of reality when it becomes too sharp, too overwhelming, too naked. Not just in others, but in ourselves. And this is where the shock begins. Because if that's true, then the most terrifying question is not, what don't I know? It's, what am I refusing to see? Let that sink in. How many beliefs do you cling to, not because they are true, but because they are comfortable? How many stories have you inherited, not questioned, because questioning them would shatter everything familiar? You call them truths, but are they just shields? Armor against the chaos of a universe that doesn't bend to your will. Now picture this. A man sees a bitter truth about himself. It burns. He turns away. He pours a drink, scrolls through his phone, tells himself a story about how everything happens for a reason. He doesn't forget the truth. He buries it. Deeper each time. Until ignorance becomes his home, decorated with rationalizations, guarded by ego, lit by artificial hope. Sound familiar? And here's the twist. Nietzsche warned us about the smarter you are, the more dangerous your ignorance becomes. Why? Because intelligence gives you better tools to build illusions. You don't just avoid truth, you justify your avoidance with precision. You weaponize thought to protect the very delusion that enslaves you. So ask yourself honestly, do you know the truth? Or do you know a version of it that lets you sleep at night? Ignorance isn't innocent. It's strategic. It's survival. Nietzsche once observed that man doesn't seek truth as much as he seeks comfort. We want to believe we are moral, sane, sovereign, awake. But behind those masks, chaos, rage, fear, the animal in us that howls when cornered by reality. And so we blind ourselves, not because we are weak, but because we are terrified of what strength might demand. You were told that knowledge is light and ignorance is darkness. But what if that's backwards? What if ignorance is the light you cling to, soft, flattering, artificial, while truth lives in the dark corners you never dare to search? What if the real terror isn't not knowing, but being known by a truth that doesn't care about your narratives? And what if Nietzsche was right? That man would rather choose nothingness than surrender his illusions. This is the shocking theory of ignorance you've never been told. It is not passive, it is violent, not absence but resistance, not innocent but defended with teeth. You've felt it, that moment when a truth breaks through and your chest tightens. You look away, you deny, you distract, you retreat to certainty like a wounded animal crawling to a den. But what if that pain, what if that crack in the wall is the only door to freedom? There's a war happening inside you, between the self that wants truth and the self that wants peace. And the cost of choosing peace might be the loss of reality itself. So the question is not, How do I learn more? The real question is far more disturbing. What am I willing to unsee in order to stay sane and deeper still? Who am I when all the lies are gone? You are now standing at the edge of something dangerous. You've pulled back the curtain. You've stared into the flicker behind the wall. So what's next? Do you look away? Or do you step through? And if you do, are you ready for what you'll find on the other side? You've seen the crack in the wall. You've felt it, that eerie, nauseating tremor when something long buried begins to surface. But what is it that keeps you from stepping through? What makes you turn away? Let's start with a simple yet terrifying premise. You don't want the truth. Not really. Not the raw, unfiltered, skin-stripping kind. You want a version of truth that feels good, that keeps your identity intact, that flatters the ego and dulls the chaos. And that's not a flaw. It's a defense mechanism, one that runs so deep it predates your language, your beliefs, even your memories. Nietzsche knew this. So did Carl Jung. Both understood that the human psyche is not primarily designed for truth. It's designed for cohesion, for a stable sense of I am, even if that self is built on illusions. Ignorance is not merely a gap in knowledge. It's an emotional survival strategy. At the root of it all is cognitive dissonance, that sickening psychic friction that occurs when reality collides with the fragile narrative of who you believe you are. Your brain hates contradiction. Your ego fears it. So when the truth becomes too dangerous, you don't correct the narrative. You defend it. You rationalize, you project, you suppress, you lie. You've seen this in others, haven't you? The person who clings to a belief that's obviously false, but clings harder when challenged. The friend who refuses to admit their relationship is toxic. The parent who rewrites the past to preserve the illusion of virtue. It's easy to judge them. But what if you're doing the same thing, just in subtler, more sophisticated ways? Here's the terrifying revelation. Ignorance isn't weakness. It's power, the power to manipulate yourself into comfort. Nietzsche called this the will to untruth. He believed that humans often choose illusion over reality, not because they are stupid, but because they are afraid of the abyss. And here's where it gets even darker. You don't just fear being wrong. You fear not existing at all, because your identity is woven from your beliefs, your culture, your past. So if one thread gets pulled, say the belief that you are a good person or that life has inherent meaning, then the entire tapestry might unravel. This is why, when threatened, the ego doesn't seek clarity, it seeks control. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust and father of logotherapy, put it like this. When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. But it's not just pleasure, is it? You distract yourself with certainty, political certainty, moral certainty, even spiritual certainty. Because certainty is warm. Certainty is safe. But the truth, the real truth, it demands that you stand naked in the storm. This is why ignorance is so seductive. It offers a clean identity, a coherent self, in a world that is anything but. And behind that seduction lives something ancient and primal fear. Fear that you are not as kind or wise or in control as you pretend. Fear that the world is not governed by justice or logic but by chaos, randomness, and decay. Fear that your suffering has no grand design, that there is no one watching, no karmic balance, no ultimate reward. So you tell yourself stories. I'm doing my best. Everything happens for a reason. They're just bad people. I know myself. But are you telling the truth? Or protecting yourself from it? Jung warned that the shadow, the part of the self we reject, doesn't disappear. It festers. It grows stronger the more it is denied. And so to remain ignorant, you must constantly battle your own unconscious. You must suppress, repress, and twist perception itself just to keep the illusion alive. That's why it feels exhausting, isn't it? Because deep down, some part of you knows. Some part of you senses the lies. You feel it in moments of silence late at night when the distractions fade and something ancient stirs. That whisper in your skull. This isn't who you are. This isn't the whole story. But even then, you turn away. Because to truly confront it would mean killing the self you've worked so hard to become. That is the psychological root of ignorance. It is a weapon the ego uses to preserve itself, not maliciously, but out of terror. Not because you are evil, but because you are human. And yet this raises the next terrifying question. If ignorance is the self-preserving armor, what lies beneath it once it cracks? Nietzsche believed that once the illusions are stripped away, once the comforting lies rot under the weight of truth, what remains is nihilism. The brutal confrontation with nothingness. And unless something deeper is found beyond that void, the self collapses into despair. That's why most people never go that far. They stop at the edge. They retreat into politics, religion, dopamine, or dogma. Anything to avoid falling through that crack in the wall. Anything to avoid seeing what's real. But what if ignorance isn't just individual? What if it's collective? What if entire cultures, religions, and political ideologies are nothing more than giant synchronized hallucinations designed to keep the truth buried? Not because there's a conspiracy, but because everyone is afraid of the same thing. What happens if we stop pretending? We call it progress. We call it civilization. But underneath the buzzwords and hashtags and economic metrics, could we just be building better masks? You've felt the edges of this already. Now you know what's behind it. But knowing the root doesn't free you. Not yet. Because if ignorance is armor, and truth is a blade, then something has to bleed before something can change. So let's go deeper. Let's look at what happens when ignorance wins. Not just inside you, but across the world. Let's face the unseen consequences of pretending not to know. You've stood at the edge. You've seen the crack. You now understand that ignorance isn't just a missing puzzle piece, it's the whole table we're building the puzzle on. A structure designed to protect the ego, to soothe the psyche, to shield the soul from the unbearable weight of truth. But what happens when that structure becomes a prison? What happens when entire societies, entire generations cling to the same comforting lie? Look around you. Every institution, every relationship, every ideology is infused with this hidden agreement. Let's not go too deep. Let's stay on the surface where things are explainable, shareable, monetizable. Where things can be turned into identity, brand, tribe, hashtag. But underneath is the silence, the discomfort, the unease. The moment when someone says, "I don't know who I am anymore," and everyone shifts in their seat, changes the subject, recommends a podcast. We are terrified of looking beneath the surface. And so we've built an entire civilization that rewards polished ignorance and punishes unsettling truth. What does that look like? It looks like politics reduced to outrage rather than understanding. It looks like religion weaponized into certainty instead of awe. It looks like social media algorithms feeding you what you already believe, not to inform you, but to keep you sedated in your curated delusion. Ignorance then becomes not just an individual flaw, it becomes a culture of speed, distraction, and dopamine, a culture that confuses visibility with value, a culture where being right matters more than being true. And so we craft versions of ourselves, avatars polished to reflect what the tribe wants to see. We learn what opinions are safe, what desires are normal, what thoughts must never be spoken aloud. We become performers of truth rather than seekers of it. And slowly, invisibly, we forget the difference. This is the price of collective ignorance. We lose the ability to recognize what is real, because reality is not kind. It doesn't trend. It doesn't flatter. Reality is complex, contradictory, and often brutal. It demands nuance. It demands humility. It demands that we say, "I don't know," and mean it. But how often do we do that? How often do we pretend to understand, to feel, to believe, simply because not doing so would cost us our place in the tribe? And this is where it becomes truly dangerous. Because when ignorance becomes cultural currency, the truth becomes a threat. Not just intellectually, but existentially. We exile the truth-tellers. We label them dangerous, unstable, radical, inconvenient. We mock the skeptic. We shame the whistleblower. We crucify the philosopher. And when that doesn't work, we distract ourselves with novelty. This is the era of noise, of information overload, of infinite scrolls and shallow certainty. You can consume knowledge 24/7 and still be completely ignorant, because ignorance isn't about information. It's about avoidance. And here's the most painful part. You can become so intelligent, so educated, so articulate, and still be a coward. Because courage isn't knowing more. It's facing what you already know and wish you didn't. But if ignorance is the refusal to see, then what happens to those we love who live their lives in the dark? What happens to the parent who never questioned their inherited values? To the friend who numbs themselves with achievement? To the child raised to believe that doubt is weakness? You watch them suffer. You watch them lie to themselves. You try to help. But every truth you offer is met with silence, with anger, with distance. This is the loneliness of awakening, because the moment you stop pretending, you lose your place in the performance. The moment you start asking real questions, you realize most people aren't looking for answers. They're looking for reassurance. And that's the real tragedy, isn't it? Not that people are ignorant, but that they are committed to it. That they are willing to suffer, to decay, to even die, rather than admit that something they believe might be false. This is not an accident. It is the consequence of generations taught to value obedience over awareness, taught to conform rather than confront, taught to belong instead of become. And the systems that benefit from this, they thrive. Because a population afraid of truth is easy to govern, easy to sell, to easy to pacify. It's the perfect trap. Tell people that they are free while quietly convincing them to fear the one thing that might actually set them free: uncertainty. Nietzsche saw this as a spiritual sickness, resentment, a deep resentment toward life itself projected onto others. The ignorant don't just hide from the truth, they become hostile to those who seek it. They develop a moral superiority around their delusion, lashing out at anything that threatens it. And so, ignorance spreads like a virus, not just protected by the culture, but enforced by it. But what if this isn't just a social or philosophical tragedy? What if it's personal? What happens to you when you suppress truth long enough? You lose your intuition. You lose your depth. You lose the raw, aching pulse of life itself. You become numb, cynical, fragmented. You start to feel like a ghost wearing a mask, smiling at parties, performing at work, scrolling through meaning like it's a feed. And slowly you stop asking questions. That's the final stage. Not anger, not rebellion, but silence. The silence of a soul that has agreed to live without seeing. The silence of a mind that would rather echo than explore. The silence of a heart that beats not with truth, but with convenience. But you are not there yet. You're still listening, still aching, still awake enough to feel the weight of what we've buried. So what now? Now you must choose. Not just whether you'll keep going, but whether you're ready to rebel. Because if ignorance is chosen, if it is built, then it can also be unbuilt. But only if you're ready to pay the price. So now you know. You see the weight of it. The ancient machinery humming beneath your thoughts, beneath society, beneath even your sense of self. The cold elegance of a lie so old you mistake it for reality. And the most brutal truth of all, no one is coming to save you. No institution, no ideology, no system is designed to lead you out of ignorance. In fact, they exist to keep you comfortably asleep, nurtured, entertained, distracted, informed. You weren't taught to rebel. You were taught to obey, to fit in, to survive. But what if surviving isn't enough? What if there is something sacred about defying what numbs you? This is where it begins, not with a riot, not with a manifesto, but with a quiet refusal. A refusal to keep pretending, a refusal to participate in the performance, a refusal to build your life on foundations that were handed to you by fear. This is rebellion, not as an act of destruction, but as an act of honesty. And it's terrifying, because the first casualty of truth is you, not the curated version, not the identity you crafted for others, but the deeper self, the buried self, the one you've been taught to ignore. And so you will grieve. You will grieve the life you built inside the cage, the comfort of belonging, the ease of certainty, the illusion of safety. But grief is not weakness. It is initiation. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." He didn't mean your personality. He meant your truth, your capacity to see without flinching, to live without armor. To break free, you must dismantle the lie layer by layer. And the first lie to fall is this: if I lose my illusions, I will be nothing. That is what the ego whispers, that it is the only thing standing between you and annihilation. But the ego is a guard dog, it barks at shadows. Its job is to protect, not to understand, and to break free, you must question your protector. Ask yourself, who am I without this belief? What if the opposite of this assumption is true? What part of me is afraid to look closer? This is the sacred ritual of philosophical rebellion. It's not loud. It doesn't win applause. It's a solitary war fought in silence between who you are and who you pretend to be. But there's something else Nietzsche taught us. He didn't believe rebellion was about becoming bitter or withdrawn. He believed it was about becoming a creator. When he said God is dead, it wasn't celebration, it was a warning. If the old structures of meaning are gone, then you must become the author of new ones. If the illusions fall, then you must create reality from your own will. This is the birth of the Übermensch, the self-overcoming human. Not superior to others, but superior to their former self. Not a tyrant, but a visionary. Someone who chooses truth even when it hurts. So what does rebellion look like? Sometimes it looks like stillness, like choosing to sit in silence rather than reach for a screen, like staying with a question instead of rushing to answer it, like confronting your shadow instead of projecting it onto others. Other times it's radical, like leaving a career built on a lie, like ending a relationship where truth has no home, like standing alone, eyes open in a world full of blindfolds. And yes, there will be suffering. But it's not the suffering of meaninglessness. It's the suffering of transformation, the pain of being burned not into ash, but into something real. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But it's not a privilege given. It's one you seize by walking straight into the fire of unknowing. And you are not alone." History is a graveyard of those who rebelled against the dream of ignorance and were punished for it. Socrates drank poison rather than stop questioning. Giordano Bruno was burned alive for daring to think beyond doctrine. Hypatia, the philosopher-mathematician, was murdered for teaching freely in a city ruled by fear. And yet, they did not apologize. They did not regret. Because once you've tasted truth, even bitter, even bloody, you cannot go back. You might walk among the sleepers. You might play along for a while. But deep inside, a spark has been lit. And that spark is freedom. Not the freedom to do what you want. The freedom to be what you are with nothing hidden, nothing denied. So the real rebellion. It's not just against society. It's not against religion or politics or culture. It's against your own fear. The fear of becoming real. The fear of being seen, truly seen by yourself. The fear that if you stripped everything away, you might find nothing underneath. But Nietzsche would tell you something else. He would lean in, eyes ablaze, and whisper, "You must become the meaning you are searching for. That is the true revolt." To no longer beg the universe for purpose, but to become the source of it. To stop consuming meaning and start creating it. So now we stand at the edge again. Only this time you know what lies behind the crack. Only this time you don't turn away. You breathe. You look deeper. You walk forward. Because rebellion isn't about breaking the rules. It's about breaking the silence that kept you numb, the silence that kept you small, the silence that kept the lie alive. But it ends here. It ends with you. So if you're ready to leave the cage behind, to walk into the unknown not as a victim but as a creator, then come. Because one final question remains, and it holds the key to everything. So here you are, no longer asleep, but not yet awake, suspended in a kind of existential dawn, half in shadow, half in light. You've torn through the veil of ignorance, seen the machinery behind the mask. You've grieved, questioned, rebelled. But now comes the most disorienting moment of all. The moment when you ask yourself, if everything I believed was a dream, then what's left? You were raised to think that truth was a destination. That once you uncovered enough, suffered enough, searched long enough, you'd find it. But Nietzsche knew better. He warned us. There are no facts, only interpretations. That sounds like a death sentence at first, as if meaning is just another illusion, shifting, unreliable, doomed to vanish. But what if that's not the end? What if that's the beginning? You've been told your entire life that the purpose of life is to find something certainty, salvation, success. But the deepest truth of all is this: there is no meaning until you create it. Not in spite of the void, but because of it. Look again. The abyss isn't empty. It's full of potential. And you are no longer a passive observer. You are the author. This is the shocking truth Nietzsche hid in plain sight. The one so radical, so liberating, so terrifying that most minds recoil from it. You are not here to discover meaning. You are here to become it. Not because the universe needs you, but because you need to awaken. When Nietzsche wrote about the Übermensch, most people misunderstood. They thought he meant domination, power, superiority. But what he meant was something far more intimate: a human being who has mastered the art of meaning-making. A being who has burned through illusion, survived nihilism, and emerged on the other side not as a cynic, but as a creator of values. Someone who can stare into the void and laugh, not because it's funny, but because they've realized the joke: we were always free. We just didn't know how to use it. Can you feel it? That weight lifting. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. Because you're no longer begging for answers. You're no longer outsourcing your worth to systems built on fear. You've seen through it, and now you are empty, and yet full. Not with borrowed beliefs, but with raw potential. The kind that can terrify and liberate in the same breath. So what do you do now? You create. Not just art or music or poetry, but moments, relationships, worlds. You live as if your life matters because it does. Not inherently, not by default, but because you've decided it does. You give your suffering a name. You give your solitude a voice. You give your silence a rhythm. That is what it means to become awake. Not to have the truth, but to become the space where truth can be born. And yes, others will not understand. They will call you arrogant, reckless, deluded. They will cling to their illusions and resent your freedom. But that's not your burden anymore. Because awakening is not evangelism. It is not your job to save the sleeping. Only to live so vividly that they feel their own dreams start to shake. You are not here to fit in. You are here to set fire to the cage. And from those ashes, you will build something terrifyingly beautiful, a life that is yours, no borrowed script, no inherited mask, no performance, just you, naked, imperfect, burning. And that is the final realization. The ultimate truth is not out there. It's not hidden in books or sermons or algorithms. It lives in the space between your fear and your freedom. It is the courage to mean something when nothing demands it. That is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. You are that why. And the world is your how. So go, not to escape the darkness, but to bring light into it, not the kind that blinds, but the kind that reveals. Because now, finally you understand, ignorance was never the enemy. It was the test of whether you would remain in the dream, or awaken into the terrifying, beautiful, brutal miracle of becoming fully alive. So what will you do now? Will you scroll past this moment, return to the comfort of the feed, the noise, the numbness, or will you let it mark you? Will you carry the scar of having seen too much and still choosing to live, to create, to love, to fight? This is the crossroads. Not between good and evil, but between forgetting and remembering, between waiting and becoming. You've already begun. Now finish the sentence, "I am no longer afraid of the truth," because say it, mean it, live it. The rest is yours to write. No one else can do it for you, and that is your liberation. Become the meaning you seek. Inspired by Nietzsche.